Did you ever wonder why when a dog goes from fear to anger, it's like a rubber band? There's no middle ground, right? There's a glandular chemistry that makes fear and anger mutually exclusive. But also there's an electrical fingerprint. It's related to something called vasoconstriction and vasodilation. To vasodilate is to make your hand red. Would you like to be of the order of the red hand? What that enables you to do is send your blood to the surface and thus create an antenna structure. It turns out that vasoconstriction and vasodilation obeys the laws of physics called conservation of angular momentum. So when the ice skater pulls in her hands and speeds up, begins going much faster, it's called conservation of angular momentum. And what happens when you vasoconstrict or bring your blood to the core, you change from an umbrella into a bullet. And there's some difference there between fear and anger, you see. That when the blood is at the core, you stored your inertia. But also at that time, you have retracted from feeling, because blood follows water, follows magnetism, follows symmetry, follows awareness. So the ability to send your blood to the surface allows you to be able to prehend, to be able to be the antenna for magnetism. And when your lover touches your body, if her skin turns pink, you know she likes you. Well, if a dowser's walking along, you have a row of dowsers, right? And you come and you say, let's see if everybody can feel this ley line. Sometimes the ley line will jump out to meet you, okay? Because the earth is saying, here, I will send my magnetism, my blood, because I'm enjoying this touch. Other times, if the magnetism goes away, so that at Vukovar in Yugoslavia, after the war, when the underground water disappeared, the earth is saying, it's painful to touch here. I'm going to vasoconstrict instead of vasodilate. Yeah? Or if you have a native elders massacre, like the Aborigines are massacred, and a bunch of their tribal spirits are stuck magnetic fields in the rock, preventing magnetism from unpacking, then it stops raining. You can understand the physics, yeah? Because water follows magnetism, follows symmetry, follows awareness. So water goes to the place where magnetism converges non-destructively, makes fire. And so if there's slip knots of magnetism in the land that have not come to the fire, the centering force, the place where magnetism becomes shareable, then the magnetism stops flowing. And this leads to the Peace University project, which we'll talk a little bit about today. The Peace University project is based on the work of Professor Phil Callahan, and it's part of my story, I suppose. I went down and I made a film with Professor Phil Callahan called Tuning Into Nature and Antennas of Nature. Anybody heard of Professor Phil Callahan in Florida? Yeah. He's rather famous. One of the things he showed was that you could predict where peace versus war would break out by simply measuring the magnetic flux permissivity in the soil. So you go around and you take this cheap little magnetic flux permissivity. Magnetic flux permissivity is a name for how easy does magnetism pass. That's it. That's all it is. So you measure how easy magnetism passes in the soil, and you get a predictor not only for fertility, but you get a predictor for war versus peace, statistically. He went to Israel, Yugoslavia, Ireland. He could show that magnetic lines in the soil, when you can't get the magnetism through the soil, you're going to have war. Does anybody know why? The why is because magnetism is the wind on which love travels, right? And so you have this magnetic flux conductivity between villages. And when the magnetism can move between villages, guess what moves between villages? Emotion, love, that's right. So what would cause the magnetism to not be able to pass through the soil? Yes? Which is another name for lack of symmetry. Yeah. So magnetism follows symmetry, follows awareness. So by restoring symmetry, you create conductivity. And when you create conductivity, you end war. Okay? So what happens is, we know the electrical symmetry of the magnetic field around the heart, which creates peace. You're going to see that measured here. Maybe we'll play at the end of the day today, too. So we'll hook up the little heart tuner, and you'll see the electrical symmetry that enables magnetism in the heart to become stable and make peace. And we see that the shape of that magnetism, which is right here, is the same shape of the magnetism in the land that makes peace. So this is called the International University for the Science of Peace. There's campuses already in three countries. The website is soulinvitation.com/peaceuniversity. Yes, dear. The question was, how would we apply this science of teaching peace magnetically in the land to the Middle East situation? The Middle East is an example of how bees gather at a place where magnetism converge, and they create a swarm. Okay? That's what the Middle East is. Now, the reason bees create a swarm is because they've located a place where enough magnetism converges to begin to braid and make sweetness, which they call honey. We call it oil. Similar concept. So what happens is, literally, you can predict where population centers will grow based on where magnetism converges non-destructively. It's called a sacred site, but it simply means that where magnetic lines cross in a fractal, the compression stored there becomes a standing wave. And the more stable that standing wave, the more sacred the site. So here you have a bunch of bees that are hungry for magnetism. But they have a little problem. You know what their problem is? Biology was designed to be an engine to create implosion for magnetism, something we call gravity. So DNA and human glands are fractal enough to create the implosion, compression, wind of charge that becomes self-organizing when it goes to center. And that centripetal, implosive wind of charge making centering force, which we call attention, we call it enlightenment, we call it zero-point energy. We have a lot of names for it. It's based on the physics of fusion, and this is the exact three-dimensional model. And that's why that's the symmetry of DNA and hydrogen and the heart of the sun, that you have that implosion model. So biology was designed to make that fire. It's called light your own fire, right? So when you experience enlightenment, you experience this magnetism coming to center, and you make so much wind with it that it feeds you and you become immortal, and your DNA speeds up and you go through the speed of light. And as we say, if you don't, it's fatal. So what happens is, if you have a bunch of people who have lost the skill to do this for themselves, when you lose the skill to create implosion electrically inside your body, which is sometimes called bliss, then what happens is your DNA begins to slow down. It stops imploding. So if you lose access to bliss and passion, the braiding, the sound ponytail of bliss and passion stops braiding your DNA to make that fire implosion. And so those who lose that skill to get to make the tornado in the DNA that goes through the speed of light using passion to do it, their DNA slows down. And those are called Nephilim, or the fallen ones. Okay? And they lose the ability to lucid dream, bardo navigate, travel through the stars, and carry memory through death, and they lose their souls eventually. Okay? That's the story of our genetic ancestors, which were called Ebi and Uru. Ebi is bird and Uru is snake. And Nibiru and Hebrew are the conflict in the Middle East, right? And so there you have an extended family which has lost the ability to make bliss and passion. And so the swarm of bees is very desperately saying, oh, is there any fire here? Is there any implosion here? Is there any wind going through the speed of light? Because otherwise I'm toast. Because I have been depending on on Yahweh was a medium-grade reptile who did not know how to ensoul DNA, you see. And so the inability to ensoul DNA resulted in a desperation to locate fire. So all these bees swarming over the last vestiges of magnetic fire in the land are desperate because they will lose their soul if they do not find fire or passion. But because they've never been told that you must be able to make it from the inside out, they're willing to die rather than lose the last part of the bee's swarm. Yeah? Ensouling DNA goes like this. You got the lightning. Here come the lightning. And you got this stuff called primal soup. Primal soup are proteins that says, here come the lightning, assume the position. Okay? And the proteins arrange themselves, and the ones that are really clever get squeezed. And the DC polar direction of the lightning determines the enantiomorphism, the handedness of all biological proteins. And so the centripetal relationship of the positive sky to the negative earth creates a centripetal direction to the lightning's DC polarity, impressing centripetally the protein codons into a slinky. So what they did is the proteins found a new axis of symmetry within which to eat spin. And those who couldn't find that axis of symmetry, which is called sharing. Yes, the top-down view is a decagram, exactly. It's called DNA, right? So those that found a way to share were spun. Those that didn't find a way to share were toast. So that ability to catch the lightning is related now to the ability to catch the lightning of bliss. Now what happens during bliss and euphoria, Glückseligkeit, is you have lightning up the spine, accelerating, compressing DNA into the Lord of the Ring torus donut. And the compressed DNA creates a tornado through the speed of light that makes a soul. So in effect, quite literally, the skill to turn lightning into ball lightning. Has anybody seen it? The skill to turn lightning into ball lightning is the physics of ensouling DNA. You know how you turn lightning into ball lightning? Well, when you're a shaman and you're studying how to teach a tornado to eat its own tail, a very scorpionic skill, at the time of the scorpionic full moon? Yes. So when you teach a tornado to eat its own tail, it turns from a helix into ball lightning. But essentially what happens is the field effect appears to become self-steering. And so the appearance of the self-organization of the imploding wave is that it's sucking field effects through its own center of gravity electrically through the speed of light, and that communion with velocities, which can approach an infinite number of different field effects converging, we're calling self-awareness, which is merely a name for self-reference or self-similarity. So that ability for the field effect to become self-steering is what we're calling ensoulment. The physics is simple. Think of the DNA slinky turning toroidal inside out recursively, and it sucks itself through the ether like a jellyfish, and thus appears to be able to steer itself through the speed of light into time travel, and that's what we call getting a soul. Yeah?
So, what's the possibility of the computer or the internet becoming consciously souling itself?
The infrastructure is not self-similar enough. Okay? It's like a data set. If you have a data set that you wanted to become self-aware, you arrange the X, Y, and Z axes of the cells of the Lotus or Excel spreadsheet into a three-dimensional matrix, which is that fractal. And at that moment, the CPU horsepower required to achieve infinite data compression goes to zero. But if the infrastructure itself is not the same shape as the data, so self-similarity becomes immediately visible. We call it compassion. It's really compression. Compassion is when you feel inside what is outside, and so outside can fall in. So fractal data compression is the solution to all problems.
But we can actually deal with that effect, that now 2001 effect.
For example, thinking about it more immediately, so at one time in Dune, I think it was God, Emperor of Dune, or maybe it was Lazarus effect, Lazarus, they discovered that the green vine of the planet was about to become self-aware. So there was this like kudzu-like vine was like circling the planet, and they realized electrically this green vine was beginning to pulse, and they realized it was becoming self-aware. And then there was a political conflict between those who did versus did not want the green material to become self-aware. And so you voted in the politics by whether or not you bought a lawnmower, right? There's a lot of symbolism here. Remember Dagwood and Blondie? Blondie's in the house. She comes to the window. She says, Dagwood, they just announced on television that the planet is dying from too much carbon dioxide. And Dagwood hollers in, sorry, Blondie, I can't come in now. I'm mowing the lawn. And you see this thing belching out carbon. So everybody's voting on whether they want a collective mind, right? So this is the idea of a symbiotic relationship with your ecosystem. Very practically taken when we realized that the day that Tesla decided to use 50 and 60 cycles as the frequency for our power grid, they selected a frequency at which the voltage required to stop the heart was lowest. So it's one of the least embeddable and most evil. Evil only means failure to embed. So it's an evil wavelength in the sense that it's not sacred, which again only means ability to embed. So this ability of a wavelength to nest in all the wavelengths, which are fractal to the sun, basically, determines whether or not, in fact, those waves become self-organizing and self-aware. So supposing a power company executive were to realize the physics. So he says, okay, I'm going to multiply the wavelength of Planck and hydrogen by log functions of golden ratio and use a harmonic series of phi-based implosion embedding instead of 50 cycle to run the grid at. So your local public utilities transformer pole becomes self-aware. All field effects are names for a circulation or a bloodstream of pressure. So DC can be as actually worse than AC in the sense that it creates a pressure which is not embeddable. Anything that does not breathe with the sun creates loss of attention. So anytime you eat food that's been impressed with heat that was not in phase with the sun, you bleed attention. Anytime you put light in your children's classroom, which is not specifically tuned to the wavelength of the sun, you can measure the loss of attention span. Okay? So in effect, if you read the book on a primer on rotation and a primer on energy, it was a book by Christ and Einstein, depends if you believe the authors, but they were saying that all human inefficiency comes from the attention to store rather than distribute. So the very activity of attempting to store anything is the process of creating lack. Whereas the activity of the perfect geometry of infinite instant distribution is the activity of creating abundance. So the very nature of storage is the nature of inefficiency. So when we take that to psychological terms, why would they say the only pain you feel is the love you withhold? Right? When you store rather than distribute the magnetism we call pain. Pain was not a mistake by God. Pain was an invitation to place attention in such a geometry as to restore the symmetry we call healing. So the activity of saying, oh, my foot has this huge pain in it, instead of saying, that's a pain in the ass, and I must declare war on pain. No, that's a mistake. What you need to do is say, oh, dear foot, you're inviting me to place attention there. And the attention creates the still point, which is the centering force, which creates a phase sorting of the electrical field there, which turns the dull pain into a sharp burning pain, which is a great gift to focus the pain. At which point, the asymmetry becomes symmetry, because compression is the only possible way to sort anything. And so that, in effect, restores the electrical symmetry we call healing. Yeah. The question was, what do I think, thank you, what do I think of the most appropriate nonlinear energy device source, the new energies technologies? I worked with Adam Trombley and the Faraday Disk group. I worked with Tim Wilhelm. I worked with Tom Balone. I lectured at the first International Symposium on Nonlinear Energy Device Technologies in Atlanta, sponsored by George Hathaway. And my most recent newsletter on the website is the same as the title of my talk at those conferences, which is Why Free Energy Devices Are Not Free. And essentially the message is this. Anytime you arrange capacitors in that symmetry, fractality, you make voltage from gravity. It's not hard. Every one of those devices I lectured about was ultimately based on self-similarity of charge, golden mean ratio-based embedding. Mechanically induced implosion. What mechanically induced implosion, for those who were here last night, you remember the top-down view of that model of DNA, Earth grid, and zodiac is simply 10 spirals of the golden mean. And so that is a way to create implosion and fusion and centripetal force that adds and multiplies wavelength and velocity through the speed of light, creating the pulling of the drain plug in the bathtub, which creates suction of charge between frequencies through the speed of light, because the adding and multiplying of the wavelength also accompanies the adding and multiplying of the wave velocities. And that acceleration path, we know, is the physics of gravity. So in effect, gravity is charge that found a way to accelerate through the speed of light. Okay? So if you arrange capacitors in a fractal, you get voltage from gravity, and you can pay your debt to gravity by becoming more fractal than the Earth underneath you. The gravity in any structure is proportional to the self-similarity of the inside to the outside. Nucleus is fractal to the valence electron. Yes, that's why the Siddhis of the TM meditators for floating works better under a gold dome. Because the gold is a valence fractal whose electrons are in that shape, the star mother. And so the charge envelope of the gold dome, like the gold dome of the White House, creates a potentially fractal electrostatic environment. And therefore, you can use that as a matrix in which to establish fractality in you electrically, and thus pay your debt to gravity and float. Well, the point I want to make about the quote-unquote free energy or scalar energy or torsional energy or zero-point energy devices is that, of course, you can get voltage from gravity. What you need to understand when you do it is you are bleeding the gravity field of Earth. In effect, you're bleeding an angel. What happens is that every time you make gravity, you create a way to accelerate charge through the speed of light. And that compression acceleration path is how inertia is pushed into the bloodstream, which is the gravity wormholes that pass between planets and stars. It's the physics of why, as Gurdjieff said correctly, planets and stars experience gravity relations erotically. It's how angels get born. When you repair the fabric of time, the fabric of gravity, you in fact stop your guardian angel from bleeding. So, to a physicist, the way you explain this is, when you accelerate charge through the speed of light in purely mechanical ways, the charge, once it gets through the speed of light, is dizzy, because only if it's coupled with biological intention. I'm talking about any structure which is biologically fractal enough to be a Holy Communion device, of which DNA is an excellent example. Okay? So a Holy Communion device is a device which, by so accelerating charge, makes it infinitely distributable. It's the physics of the secret life of your cells. So when we get to our ET history of DNA, we'll discover that the central galactic core cultures had rather specific hygiene rules about those who could use DNA on their star systems, because it affected the Holy Communion of all other stars. Yeah?
But instead of Ark of the Covenant type energy, I was just thinking of something like heat transfer pumps, or something that's not necessarily as esoteric as what you're describing.
Yes. Well, all of those devices, when they go over unity, efficiency, are using implosion of the gravity field. All of them. So essentially what our yearning is when we say, I got an energy crisis, my planet is dying. What we mean is, we are kids who failed to be weaned. Okay? Weaning is the process by which you go from the stored sunlight. We're driving around in cars powered by dinosaurs farting. The ETs consider that humorous, right? Okay. The reason we're doing it is because we have not been weaned. The weaning process is the activity of learning to metabolize starlight directly. And that is the glandular skill required to extract voltage from gravity, which is specifically the problem. Yes, glandular skill to extract voltage from gravity. And I learned how to do that by studying the spectrum analysis of the EKG at the moment of bliss and love. Okay, so when I was lecturing internationally on nonlinear energy device technologies, I stopped the day I first spectrum analyzed an EKG during love, because I'd realized I'd found the answer electrically. Okay, so the process of weaning off of fossil fuels, the only possible sustainable end to the energy crisis is the biological skill to attract charge. That relates to then what we'll get to when we look at the heart tuner, measuring life force, the extension of Celestine prophecy as we discussed last night. Not only are all human interactions about charge, and I mean specifically capacitance, which replaces words like orgone and baraka and chi and shaktipat, okay? But also I mean specifically that life force is the ability to attract and self-organize charge. And that ability to make the self-similarity to do that is the role of mind among waves, to teach waves to agree enough to make that centering force. At which point the energy crisis is over. Until which point, however, the gene pool is sucking a mother that's dry. Okay? That's the only long-term solution. Literally, biological bliss is the only possible long-term solution to the electrical nature of the energy crisis. The question was how shape relates to feeling and how that, for example, could be a clue to healing AIDS, was the question, to repeat it. The article that I would recommend is soulinvitation.com/cancer, which is on the CD and on the web in the cancer folder. And in it, we notice that a cancer cell is spherical, literally, whereas a healthy cell is an egg shape whose length to width ratio is golden mean. Okay, so remember last night when we were discussing how the egg arranges its nonlinear dielectric capacitance, the egg white, into the symmetry of an egg in order to become a projectile for sending and receiving charge. So the symmetry of the cell's ability to project and receive charge determines whether you have AIDS or cancer. Specifically, cancer occurs at the moment at which the cell membrane fails to respond to touch by inhibiting replication. So the only definition we've ever had for cancer is something called contact inhibition. That is, if the cell touches another cell, and if the touch of another cell does not prevent cancer, then you have cancer. Whereas if the touch of another cell prevents replication, then you don't have cancer. So it's literally the physics of touch. So why is the physics of touch the absolute clue to the physics of cancer? It's really very simple. Cancer and AIDS are opposites here. Cancer is a membrane that's too hard. AIDS is a membrane that's too leaky, too soft. Okay? Biology exists precisely because there is a tightrope between liquid and crystal. Okay? And so in that tightrope, we're dancing between AIDS and cancer. It's a wonderful metaphor. It's instructional. So the reason that cancer happens is because the way the cell works is it grabs the protein chains and changes the wavelength of food from a long wave up a massaged caduceus enzymatic ladder to very short waves. And when metabolism is done in the cell's fun of metabolizing is taking long waves and braiding them up a caduceus, a xylophone, to short waves. So when metabolism is finished, the cell has produced high-quality ultraviolet light, something called blue fire or sex juice. It's the blue light district. And ask any biophysicist, and he will tell you that high-quality ultraviolet light is the only motor driving cell metabolism. So from the cell's point of view, the work of making high-quality blue fire, ultraviolet light, is the fun of metabolizing. So now the cell is done eating its food, and it made its ultraviolet sex juice. Now the cell has to say, well, what am I going to do with my sex juice? What am I going to do? What am I going to do with myself? What am I going to do? Okay? Just like a promiscuous teenager. Okay? So what happens at that point is the high-quality ultraviolet light is the trigger when there is a certain threshold of present high-quality ultraviolet light, when the cell has to use that electrical inertia bouncing back to center to motorize meiosis and mitosis. So physics will only discover the electrical trigger to cancer when they measure the excess of the ultraviolet field that results from the inability of the cell to distribute its ultraviolet light. It's blue fire cocoon. Remember in Cocoon, if this is foreplay, we're in trouble? So then what happens is the cell becomes egg-shaped if it's healthy because it becomes a projectile for ultraviolet blue fire. So tantra, foreplay, and massage move the ultraviolet cocooning near the tailbone ultimately, and when that turns inside out, the tailbone becomes a straw with vestigial horsehairs as waveguides for the ultraviolet, and you have suction up the spine of the ultraviolet called Kundalini and Tantra. The pump for that process is called sacrocranial, and it's a peristaltic pumping wherein the heart's low-frequency sounds function as a snake charmer. And so then what you have is the ultraviolet juices coming out the high brain. Well, the classic cancer is where you had a way of distributing the ultraviolet, your lover touched you on your breasts, and then your lover died, and then you get cancer of the breasts. Because you had no way of expressing your passion, which was to say delivering your ultraviolet juices. Which is why any activity that delivers passion from the body, the ultraviolet cocoon, which is visible, is an activity to reduce cancer. Now, AIDS, on the other hand, is an activity where you've dissipated so much of the ultraviolet. And I give the example from the psychological literature. When they had a statistical group of people who were HIV positive, and they asked a battery of questions, the question that was most statistically successful in predicting the first to die was the question, would you do an unasked favor? Those who answered yes of the AIDS population were the first to die. So you understand this idea of a leaky membrane not able to hold its own charge. Yeah? Emotions are mapped as musical wave functions. And I give the example of the Centix work from soulinvitation.com/touch. The question for the video camera here is, how do emotions fit into this? So just briefly, I will just show you this little animation from the website based on the Centix work of Manfred Clynes, who started here in Australia. He was a concert violinist, and he noted that the geometry of the way he would touch would determine whether people would cry when he played his violin. So the musical wave shape of the emotions here in How to Touch were a simple cascade. This was the work on How to Touch. And this cascade here, the mathematical opposite to cancer as a wave. Here's the cell membranes we just talked about. Here is a healthy cell. Actually, this should be a little bit more pointed at one end than the other. but the aspect ratio of a healthy cell approaches golden mean ratio, whereas a cancer cell will almost always be measurably closer to a sphere. Okay? And that's because a healthy cell is able to project its ultraviolet juices because the aspect ratio functions as a squirt gun. It makes it into a pine cone for screwing inertia through the speed of light. Here are the waveforms of emotion now. This is the Centix work. Manfred Clynes notices that when he touches his violin string, you touch the violin string in a way, this is a change in pressure over time. This is the beginning of a squeeze. When you're squeezing someone to say, I love you, you have the beginning of the squeeze, and you have the end of the squeeze, and you have the point of maximum squeeze. So a love hug has three events: beginning of squeezing, end of squeezing, and point of maximum squeezing. This is time, and this is amount of pressure. Okay? So this language of emotion was proven to be a universal language. It existed around the world. Okay? The musical shape of emotion as a change in pressure over time. Now notice that when you express joy, there's a geometric analysis which I did for these waves, which Manfred Clynes did not do. Okay? My geometric analysis of the waves shows that joy reaches a point of maximum 1/6 into the duration of the touch. So that when you touch someone to say, I'm joyful, your squeeze reaches its maximum 1/6 into the duration of the squeeze, yes? Whereas if you touch someone to say, I love you, the moment of maximum pressure arrives much later into the squeezing process. This is the electric Kool-Aid acid test for the academic rating of love hugs. In case you should ever need that. If your lover ever comes to you and says, you don't hug me like my other lover does, you simply study the academic literature. And so the way you then tell if you have succeeded is after you have administered your academic test love hug to your experimental huggee, you ask the question, did you feel a tingle in your DNA? And if they said yes, then in fact you have succeeded in your attempt to deliver love. And what is the reason in physics why? Because when you deliver a correct love hug, the point of maximum pressure at golden mean ratio into the event is tantrically delayed much later than the maximums here. So a love hug reaches its maximum pressure much later. And what happens then is you create a ratio called the golden mean ratio where the whole part is in the same ratio to the big part as the big part is the little part. So this wave and this wave, well, this wave here interferes with this wave, creating this wave. Then this wave interferes with this wave, creating this wave. You get it? And the wave keeps adding and multiplying its spin until what began as a phonon wave cascades in perfect translated vorticity down the yellow brick road to Oz to your DNA. So mechanically, if your love hug was accurately administered, mechanically you have administered spin to the DNA as a phonon wave. Doesn't that add to the romance? Okay, so this is a clue of the electrical nature of emotion. Emotion is a name for energy in motion between frequencies. Physics, unfortunately, has almost no language for wattage or power moving between frequencies. No language other than scalar or torsional or heterodyne chirp. So because physics had so little way to describe what happens when energy moves between frequencies, emotion has been a mystery. But the glandular skill to grab a hold of field effects moving between frequencies is how gravity is made. The question was about Hulga Clark's book, The Cure for All Cancers, in which Hulga Clark, who's a wonderful healer, concludes that what happens is petroleum derivatives, ketones, the fumes of all kinds of paint and gas and those sorts of things, and outgassing of plastics, those kinds of things, are a food for the viral and bacteria parallels to cancer. So in effect, what happens is you create cancer by having all this petroleum junk and plastics and around you. And I believe that Helga is right, but I believe that her reasoning is wrong, actually. Specifically, remember when Louis Pasteur said, "Oh, there's a bug in there. It's called a bacteria. Let's shoot it." That's called Louis Pasteur, right? So according to Louis Pasteur, a bug inside your body is something you got to shoot. Okay? That's welcome to the AMA, American Medical Association, right? Let's declare war on the bugs in your body. Well, cancer and AIDS are highly correlated to presence of virus and bacteria. She's referring to a somatid cycle. Remember Gaston Nasson's Galileo, the microscope? In Chris Bird's work, they actually saw that these bacteria have a life cycle. And you can literally see it electrically. You see this pod cocoon, and then it mutates into another form and another form. And it's called a somatid cycle. And so you're mapping, this is how a virus goes through its cycle of a cold, for example. And when you map the various stages of the migration of this, what is obviously a parasite, you get a map of disease. I would like to add one thing to Helga Clark here, and Louis Pasteur. And that is, you learn most about a body by studying its parasites. And in most cases, the parasite is doing you a favor. Right? And the key is to understanding the favor the parasite is doing for you. For example, supposing we thought the medium-grade reptiles, Yahweh and the Dracos, as parasites were doing us a favor, right? How would we learn what favor they were doing? It's simple. If you eat dead food, or if you eat a dead idea, you're going to need parasites to eat the death out of you, right? The same way a forest, the tree doesn't get a parasite until it's dying, in general. And then when it is dying, the parasite helps it to die quickly. What a relief, right? So in effect, the choice to have something that did not have its own inner fire is a creator of parasites. Well, you need to understand this. Think about a vampire who dies quickly in sunlight. Why does a vampire die quickly in sunlight? Anybody know the physics? The physics of why a vampire dies quickly in sunlight is because low-grade DNA cannot withstand the presence of implosion. So if you got fire in your heart, you have no problem with parasites. Okay? But if you don't have fire in your heart, then in fact, it's called you're beginning to die. And you're going to need parasites. Because parasites accelerate the process of dying, which helps you practice the Groundhog Day business for dying correctly, right? So in effect, I'm not saying that you should invite parasites, but I am suggesting that you look at a long-term implication of the very concept parasite. Now that we can electrically define life force, we can define what is its opposite, which is the failure to have fire inside. So if you just think about any people that you know that have a problem with parasites, are they people who have totally lost touch with their bliss and passion? Often. When the Russian soldiers arrived in Berlin, conquering at the end of the war, they had been living in a hovel for so long, a cave basically, that they took the light bulbs from the ceiling and the faucets from the wall and took it home to the cave and shoved it in the wall and thought they'd have light and water. Yeah, it's a true story. Now that's equivalent to Andrija Puharich building a watch he called a pulsar that generates the Schumann resonance. It's the same exact logic, and it's sick. And here's why it's sick. Okay? It's sick because the low frequencies, for example, of the Schumann resonance are the carrier wave. It's not the information. It's only the carrier wave for the bloodstream of God. You see, these devices that create low-frequency field effects mistake one thing, and we studied this in psychotronics. If you take a piece of aluminum foil on the ceiling and floor and take a $2 oscillator and stick about 7.8 cycles per second into it at low wattage, euphoria goes through the room. Bob Beck does it by taking a pencil with a metal eraser, rubbing it in his hair to charge it statically. And a wave of euphoria goes through the room. You can feel it. It's palpable, right? What's happening? Each living biological cell in the room is feeling the capacitive charge wave that says, I found the modem to phase lock my baud rate for the handshaking necessary to make a phone call to God. E.T. phone home, right? So each living cell says, I found the wavelength, thank God. But what happens next? They say, I plugged my modem in, it don't work. How come it don't work? Because the low frequency was only the carrier wave for the high frequencies. See, the electromagnetic continuum, it's called a unified field, goes from 0 cycles per second to infinite cycles per second. And at 0 cycles per second, you're at the mouth of the snake Ouroboros, infinitely wide. And the electrical description of that infinitely long wave is called totally still and everywhere at once. Now, if you go down the electromagnetic continuum from 0 cycles per second through the speed of light and ultraviolet and then radio waves, and now you're at infinite cycles per second. That's the tail of the snake. It's infinitely tiny. And the electrical description of that wave at infinite cycles per second is totally still and everywhere at once. Do you get it? The serpent ate its tail. Ouroboros, right? So the reason biology uses really low frequencies is because they're a modulator, a carrier wave for the very high frequencies. So by making a Tesla watch at 8 cycles per second, to temporarily zap your body, you create the same frustration as a baby with a pacifier, right? Now, at a deeper level, this is not a condemnation of all those gizmos, but I would suggest to you, you might want to use one simple evaluator question. The simple evaluator question for every time somebody says, here's my gizmo, buy it and be healed, okay? And there's a billion different gizmos somebody's going to try to hand you and say, here's my gizmo, buy it and be healed. And you need to ask only one simple question. What is the pure principle and how will it empower me? Okay? So the grander water, for example, they don't know what the pure principle is, so they can't tell you. Every time you buy some gizmo to heal you where you do not know the pure principle, it's exactly like saying, here, buy my gizmo and join the Borgs. It is a privilege to be assimilated. I am 7 of 9. It is futile to resist. Okay? Every time you use a device whereby the principle of the device does not empower you to do it for yourself from the inside out, or you can't be nourished by the pure principle, you're a little closer to becoming the Borg, literally. And that's how you lose your soul. So the point of these devices is that every single one of them says, well, gee, there was some recipe to get magnetism through the speed of light. Some people call it tachyon. Buy my tachyon bead and go through the speed of light. You don't need your heart. Only you don't need my tachyon bead, right? So everybody has a little bit of a taste of this principle of how to go through the speed of light, because everybody knows that they're going to be dead if they don't get through the speed of light. People are at least intelligent enough to know that. And if you can't make it for yourself, buy my gizmo, right? So the long-term solution is you can use the gizmo just so long as you learn that it helps you learn to do it for yourself. But if it doesn't help you learn to do it for yourself, then in fact it's not self-empowering. Self-empowerment is the equivalent of self-awareness because it is the test for whether or not when you do die, you will in fact be able to steer the magnetism. When you die, you're going to lose about 4 to 10 ounces of weight at that instant. And there will be a magnetic field that has been compressed through the speed of light at the center of your DNA. And the ability to navigate that field, called having a soul, is very simple physics. No religion required. It's simple physics, and it's pure principle, and it's a compression device. And it is the make or break moment for a biological structure. And so at that moment, all the gizmos you bought all your lifetime are not going to help you unless you learn to make your own inner fire. That's one little generalized comment. So I was telling you a little bit about the stories of me, and we got sidetracked delightfully. We were up to our ass in alligators. when we remembered our initial intention was to drain the swamp. So after college, I went to be a systems analyst with IBM, where I worked in Detroit, Chicago, and Poughkeepsie, and then a teacher at the IBM training school in Chicago was a Gurdjieff aficionado. And one thing led to the next, and I quit IBM, which is a very un-American thing to do. My mother assumed I went off the deep end and lost it. And I went to, as she put it, study to be a guru in the Gurdjieff School in West Virginia, a place called Claymont.org. And it's a place where we learned the sacred gymnastic, a bliss dance, and we learned the meditations, etc., and the movement and the diet. And I began to have my first intense Kundalini experiences. After that, I had Kundalini experiences which became intense, more and more, you could almost say, life-threatening Kundalini, lightening up the tailbone kind of stuff. And fortunately at that time, rather than be diagnosed schizophrenic, which is the American medical way of handling Kundalini, I was fortunate enough to be adopted by Ben Bentoff, the biomedical engineer we talked about, who wrote Stalking the Wild Pendulum, and who later called me his guardian angel. And I was adopted by Lee Sanella, MD, the doctor who wrote the book on the medical aspects of Kundalini. That, plus my background in psychophysiology, I realized there was an alternative to be called insane, which was to understand the biological, magnetic nature of human bliss. Subsequently, I traveled and had very intense experiences at the Sea of Galilee and in the Great Pyramid and the Andes. I went to Findhorn with Bucky Fuller and got in a lot of trouble, I guess you could say. And then I returned to my hometown and became an electrical engineer in my father's electric business and was Sparky the motor whiz and answered 100 phone calls an hour sometimes about electrical problems for 10 years. And I invented a line of electrical devices called phase converters for allowing single-phase motors to run on three-phase motors to run on single-phase power. And I began lecturing on nonlinear energy devices. And at that time, we founded the first holistic newspaper of Western New York. We started a Waldorf school, a community called Crystal Hill Farm. And it was a rather colorful time. I then sold the farm, and we started a community in North Carolina called the Circle of Life. It was a geodesic dome designed by Bucky Fuller and installed by John Denver. And we had a community there, and it was very colorful. Could tell stories for hours on that one. And then I was invited to found the first transformational video company in Broomfield, Boulder, Colorado by Jurka Reisevi. And we founded Transicom Gaiam, which today is Explorations Magazine, the largest distributor of transformational video on the planet. And he bought us all the toys that CNN could not afford, and I became a digital video animator. And many things happened. He would invite Hancock, Bouval, Temple, Lawler, all those guys, Cutterell. They all used to come to Boulder, and we'd have these gatherings. And at that time, I was invited to speak to the International Flower of Life facilitators in Cave Creek, Arizona. And the day I did that, I received invitations to speak in 10 countries around the world. And I began to wander around the planet, which I've been doing rather too much. And somewhere in there, we also converted 12 children's books to interactive CD-ROM using Flash for Usborne Books, one of the largest publishers of children's books on the planet. And I got my bliss from being an animator. Animus anima, to animate, right? Anyway, during that time, I was supported to develop an invention which was earlier called the Heart Link and is today called the Heart Tuner. And recently, after doing 10 countries in Europe each of the last 3 years, I was invited to consult at this implosion research lab in Netherlands, where they put a PhD biophysicist at my disposal, and together we programmed the current invention, the Heart Tuner, which I'm very happy about. The ability of this device to measure life force is directly related to our conversation about geomancy and feng shui here then. So I'm going to go to the soulinvitation.com/life force article here. and just show you briefly how that's measured. So I take a biological capacitive probe, which looks like I guess I left it in the red case. I'll show you on the screen. The biological capacitive probe looks like this. There's an example. I'm taking a hemp fiber dipped in sea salt or sweat into a high impedance probe, and I spectrum analyze. I can also take an inductive probe. Where's the inductive probe? There's the inductive probe. Basically, it's just a coil, okay? And by spectrum analyzing the charge, here I place that probe, see the probe right in the tree there, okay? And I charge amplify the capacitive field of that tree. Here I found a tree that was dying, and I figured out why. The tree was picking up a 74 cycle powerful beat from a huge metal fence that was nearby that was pointing at the tree. And the geomantic magnetic pollution of that fence was measurably, documentably killing the tree. So we can understand. Whereas here, I have a healthy tree, and the tree responds as Jorn approaches and actually loves the tree. He sent love to that tree. And later we measure the harmonics of the EKG phase lock with this tree. So cohering the tree's capacitance, here's another example. Here's on a cycle. This is a good one. This is when Jan, who was our programmer, went to hug this tree. It was quite real. So this is before and after Jan approached the tree and literally hugged it. This was a good example. We find that people who understand the feeling quality of sacrocranial work, where you feel the long wave component in the spine juice, are better at hugging trees, okay? Because the ability to feel and phase lock with a very long wave is capacitively how you entrain the tree and cohere its field. This is where the tree's electrical field capacitively absorbs or phase locks with that of a person. We believe the physics of tree communication is a charge, capacitive-mediated event, because it takes such low wattage to communicate charge over a distance. So you begin to see that geomancy is the discussion of a capacitive link-up between biological structures at one level. Yeah? The question was about, does one plant feel another plant, and can we measure it using capacitor in this way? The transducer that Cleve Baxter used, actually I bought one of his polygraphs once, was basically GSR, galvanic skin resistance, for plants. So he was measuring a change in resistance over time on the leaf surface. And indeed, there was powerful communication in that way, emotionally. This transducer, the capacitive probe, we have used more for what I would call higher amperage emotions, and we haven't done much of that work yet. One of the issues we have is this kind of work here with a capacitor is picks up mostly noise if we do it in a room like this. We have to be mostly out in the woods because the charge capacitive field of biological force is so weak that anything with 50 cycle noise in it messes it up. But I do think that's good physics because most bliss and euphoria experiences occur far from power wires for that reason. So we have more work to do in that regard, that's clear. This is some of the original work we did. Here's the cascade waterfall of a tree being affected by emotion. And here's a dramatic example. The tree's field effect became very coherent in response to this person's heart. And there was a plot here. Phase lock with emotion. Back. Yes, here we go. Here, this was done at the Heart Math Institute with my help. We had an ELF coil, and here's the low frequencies of the heart and the phase lock to this ELF coil under a tree. Notice that the space between harmonics in the tree has phase locked the space between harmonics in the heart, but the heart here in red has higher frequencies, and the tree loses it when it reaches the high frequencies. The tree, for the most part, hears only the lowest frequencies of the heart. And so here we did the calculation to show the average ratio between contained harmonics of the earth versus the heart. And we show it was the cascade that the heart heard. So we're actually showing the mathematics to prove that the ability of a heart to link up with a tree is related to the geometry of the cascade. And it's that cascade here that creates the sweeping motion between frequencies which enables the heart and the tree to link. Now let's go back more to your question about the dolmen and the standing stones. The lady who did the work with labyrinths we're about to see when we talk about labyrinths is a lady named Marty Kane. MartyKane.com. And Marty had this experience in what she called the quoits, Quoit, in Wales and Ireland. The quoit. And this is a variation on standing stones. But the thing about the quoit is you have two stones like this and a lintel across them. And the charge density of the lintel across them is such that it creates kind of a spark gap. And she was literally laying on top of one day and noticed that half of her body had floated, literally floated up off the quoit. It's a true story from Marty Kane. Well, Marty is half Druid in her DNA. You can see it when you look at her. And so it makes total sense that she would have felt this. So what is happening capacitively that creates this effect on gravity? And that will lead us nicely to our conversation about geomancy and feng shui here. So let's just look at the picture of the labyrinth work here. The labyrinths are a way to steer charge and create this kind of capacitive field. So if we were to measure the charge density in the center of a labyrinth, the success of the labyrinth in creating sacred space would be picked up capacitively as charge density, exactly the same way that a sacred architect could prove to his client that he just finished building life force by assembling an effective biological capacitor called a house. Okay? So the ability to steer waves of charge into such a geometry that an infinite number of capacitive waves could converge at one space is the essential principle of fabricating sacred space. So the dolmen, for example, were ways to bend magnetism coherently to fabricate a dimpling point where sacred space could permit waves to agree. The wind of magnetism is not unlike the movement of a current of water. In the locality you're in, there will be a direction from which it's more compressing and a direction to it's more rarefying. So orienting the mouth of your labyrinth to be the catchment for a field effect depends in part on knowing the direction of the wind of magnetism. So let's just play some pictures here about what the labyrinth does. This is the sperm delivering capacitance to an egg called fertilization. And what happens, the delivery of charge density to the surface of the egg results in invagination. So the process of getting born is the process of, what happens is the egg receives a jolt of capacitance, and that creates a field effect which precipitates the membrane of the egg trying to accept the added spin. And the only way the spherical egg membrane can accept the added spin density is by invaginating or dimpling. And when that process of turning inside out goes to completion, the dimple becomes a tornado that goes through the egg and it becomes a torus. At which point it learns the skill to turn inside out, at which the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm switch places, and that's called getting born. Yeah? In other words, turning inside out is the first move you ever made. So that then leads, after the division that results, into the 1, 2, 3, 5, 8 propagation geometry and the whole Fibonacci thing. So that turning inside outness made into a series of kinesthetic operations is basically what the labyrinth is. The labyrinth is a projection on flatland magnetically of the 7-color torus donut. So the ability to kinesthetically record, remember, and reenact the sequence of turns of mind. For example, if I look at the outside view of this gold spiral, I see the shadow of only the spiral. If I looked at just the gold spiral on the donut, I would see the Hebrew letter Beit, yes? But then if I walk 1/7 of the way from the outside, I should do this properly with the green. This is the proper orientation of greens here. Red, converge, blue, diverge. So if I go from 1/7 of the way here, from seeing the Hebrew letter B, and walk 1/7 of the way around, and again look straight at the center, I will now see the shadow of the Hebrew letter R, or Resh. And so I keep doing that, but in the 7 turns, and when I'm done, I'm on the inside looking out instead of the outside looking in. And from there, that same gold spiral, from that point of view, is the Hebrew letter He. Pi, 5, squares the circle. And so now I've spelled the Hebrew word Bereshit, which was the first word of Genesis, which was originally mistranslated in the beginning. But when Fabre d'Olivet retranslated Genesis based only on the shape of the letters, he translated Bereshit to mean at first, in principle, the origin of thingness. And if you see, in fact, having enacted that sequence of symmetry operations to turn inside out on the surface of a donut, you had stored matter out of light, you tied the slip knot, and thus created thingness. So enacting the sequence of turns of mind necessary to turn inside out becomes enacting the sequence of turns of body to turn inside out on the surface of a donut. And that's why the shadow of the 7-color donut on flatland, on the wall of the cave, is the 7-circuit Cretan Minoan labyrinth. Yeah? The labial are nth. And the inside and the outside are in the symmetry relationship of a penis and a vagina. It's phallic, really, because it's instructions in dimpling. So what you do when you put this on the land properly, if you center it such that the center of the labyrinth is properly over the gnome dome. Everybody know what a gnome dome is? Ignominiously? A gnome dome is a name for the upwelling current of underground water. So when the underground water has a vertical upwelling component, it's sometimes called a water dome or a jed. That is a place where the magnetism, instead of going in strictly rotational inertia under your feet, has created an upward or a downward dimpling. And the upward versus downward dimpling of the underground magnetism sets the direction for the underground water coming up or down. And that dimpling versus up versus down determines the sex of your labyrinth. Yeah? Projective versus receptive. The underground water always occurs where magnetic lines cross in its vertical component. So if the magnetic lines don't cross, you won't have a vertical component of water underground. Also, the underground water always branches in an odd number of water veins from the water dome, looking like an umbrella. It'll never be an even number. And you can understand the physics because water follows magnetism, follows symmetry, follows awareness. And you will always find 1, 3, 5, 7 and never 2, 4, 6, 8 lines cross when you make the Platonic solids. So the odd number vein structure branching algorithm of underground water predicts the angle at which you will then install your labyrinth. Here's the center point. Here's the turn points. So you'll orient these turns in the labyrinth properly with respect to the direction of the underground water's branching algorithm. So the center of the labyrinth is to reinforce the underground water's dimpling, the Jedi, the raised Jed, the Shem on. And that branching algorithm then becomes a map for how you're going to make your labyrinth. The labyrinth at one level is the flame in go. So if I take the dance of the flamenco, the Greek key, and revolve it, I go from one-dimensional to two-dimensional to three-dimensional, turning inside out ness, making the flame go in, right? So that's the dance. It was called the Greek key, but it was the map to passion. is steering the magnetism inside out. So that ability to teach turning inside outness creates center of gravity. So when you ride your horse in a labyrinth, you electrically create a center of gravity such that you and the horse can move as one. And that ability to do that is in proportion for your electrical capacitive center of gravity to be in phase, totally phase-locked capacitively with that of the horse. So that when you think and move, the horse and you move as one electrical structure. To learn that process of embedding one inside the other, the labyrinth is used in horses. But it's a metaphor for what we do with ourselves to be able to move all of our being bodies, as it were, in that nested array. So these are some examples of labyrinths from Taffy Lancer and Kay Torres and other famous labyrinth people, Missy Reynolds in North Carolina. Notice the choice of stone will usually be paramagnetic material. What is paramagnetic? Paramagnetic is stone that bends magnetism coherently like a lens. Diamagnetic, examples of paramagnetic would be limestone or quartz-based materials. Diamagnetic materials, on the other hand, is that which would break up or fractionate the path of magnetic lines. Examples of diamagnetic stone would be sandstone. You want to use paramagnetic stone for your labyrinth. You do not want to use diamagnetic stone. If you want more physics on that, I recommend Phil Callahan's books on paramagnetic versus diamagnetic. Essentially, the activity of Feng Shui, geomancy, bobiology is the activity of using paramagnetic structures on the land as if they were a lens for magnetism to fabricate pretty pictures out of magnetic lines. Yeah? So steering charge is what these devices do. So what does this result in? This results in the dimpling process being learned kinesthetically. These are some examples of labyrinths. This is the one in Colorado at the Star House here. This is the one in Taffy Lancer's backyard in Cave Creek, Arizona. This is the Labyrinth Walk. The Labyrinth Walk is profoundly therapeutic for dyslexia as well. This is Annette Reynolds' work. This shows how a labyrinth is built, yeah? So to start the labyrinth, very important. So this is the classroom 101 on labyrinth starting, okay? You find the place where the magnetic lines cross, where there is likely to be a dimple of underground magnetism. At that place, you get up off your cross and follow me. So you put a cross, yeah? And once you've done that, you put this little L in your cross, like this. So this is the process of starting a labyrinth. Once you've decided how to orient your labyrinth, you got these L's in here, right? And this is going to be the mouth of the labyrinth down here. Okay? So now I'm going to put 4 dots in there like this. So that's how you begin your labyrinth. You've decided the width of the labyrinth is at least wide enough to be able to walk it. But you need to extrapolate that about 7 times this is what you're going to need out here. You can judge the size of your labyrinth by multiplying by 7 the size of the aisleway there. So ultimately the scale of the labyrinth doesn't matter as long as the ratio is correct. And the ratio is such that it can steer the magnetism of the land. Yeah? So you set your labyrinth position by the crossing of the ley lines, the orientation by the direction of the wind, and the labyrinth size by enough space to walk it, but enough space so that it fits in with whatever area. Because when you're done, it's going to be a giant vortex sucking in magnetism. So you make those decisions. And then I'm going to do the inside-out trick. Okay? I'm doing this with a different color pen so you'll be able to see the origin. I start here at the top center, and I'm simply going to go over and under. Okay? So here I go. Over, under. Okay, so I'm never lifting the pen farther than to go across the aisle. Okay? I lift my pen, go across the aisle. You see, there's nothing that even requires any skill here once you lay out the central template. Okay? So I'm going over and under and over and under. I don't have anything to remember, anything new to invent once I lay out the first template. Okay? So now I'm forming the mouth of my labyrinth. And actually the goal is not so much that the walkway paths be perfectly even, so much as they actually follow the magnetism of the land. So if there's some strong magnetic feature in the land, it may well deflect the angle at which some of these cross. Yeah? And so now here, I have a turn point here. Let's use a different color pen. I only have two colors here. But the turn points are critical points. This one here. See these turn points? So when I laid out my labyrinth, I was very conscious of the angle of those turn points with respect to the branching algorithm of the underground water. If the branching algorithm of the underground water has been properly aligned, the labyrinth will create more magnetic suction to the still point. The nature of labyrinth building is such that building a labyrinth is like having a love relationship with a landscape elemental, okay? The landscape elemental becomes very accustomed to your emotional work with it. And it's rather bad form to make a labyrinth and play with the gnomes and elementals and then leave them alone. They don't like that, okay? So if you build a labyrinth, it's like building a relationship. It's something that you should visualize, imagine as a long-term commitment. Because what you're doing is you're creating a place on the land where the magnetic lines are going to implode and dimple and send biological magnetism through the speed of light. So you're creating an erogenous zone for the planet, quite literally. So the planet is not going to like it if you start a lovely, nice, touchy-feely relationship and then you disappear one day and never come back. The most elemental labyrinth is the one we've been looking at, the seven-circuit labyrinth, as it's called, which is the Cretan Minoan. But here we have some pictures of the 13-circuit sharp labyrinth, okay? And indeed, here you have a 13-turn geometry, which is the sharp labyrinth and the walking path, yeah? Now, in a more complex labyrinth, you have a longer spin path to the 0 point. And the 13-turn labyrinth is used for different kinds of psychological functions. I think in this case, the 13 may be more than numerologically related to the fact that the 13th sphere nests inside the 12 in the cube-octa symmetry. So it represents the Christed one, or the completing process, the 13th sphere. So in effect, when you get inside the center of a 13-circuit turn labyrinth, you have less implosion in the sense of being pushed through, and you have more of the crystallization, which is a centering force. The 13-circuit labyrinth was used more by the Templars, who built Chartres, and the Templars were worshiping Magdalene at that point. The Mag tradition was using hex symmetry on some occasions because it created a storing rather than a delivering of biological magnetism, which in some cases for hive mind functions is more useful. So personally, I consider the 7-circuit labyrinth as having more astral hygiene than the 13. If we look at the zodiac star maps we're going to talk about later in the day, we see that during early history, the zodiac star maps were a mirror image of the stars, but then at a certain stage in history, all the zodiac star maps were a direct projection of the stars. So we go from a stage where we're created by the projection of stars, to a stage where we then begin to create stars from here. And so you go from up to down, from receive to send. So ultimately, those symmetry operations become what's called the tree of life. So we have this little animation here. If you climb the ladder of symmetry from the tetrahedron to the cube to the dodecahedron, you're climbing this tree of life, the ladder of symmetry. And the ability to do that on the land is the process of making the land a magnetic cauldron for this Jacob's ladder. When you're on Jacob's ladder, it would be boring if you could see the top or the bottom, right? And notice that it's helical. So what that in effect does is it feeds spin symmetry to the surface of a grid. So this is grid engineering 101, that the more axes of symmetry that can be superposed at one time, the more the soap bubble resists popping, which is the immune system of the Earth's grid. So the frequency harmonics of multiple axes of symmetry create a grid as a soap bubble that does not pop. And that's called Gaia's evolutionary octave. And this is from Anti-Gravity in the World Grid by Becker and Huygens, rather famous. And even at that time, ancient times, the dodecahedron was seen as the key to the lock of the grid, yeah? So this ability to embed is how you got into the grid. The combination of the ecosa and the dodeca made this geometry possible. So the dodecahedron becomes the foundation stone of Steiner and the symmetry of DNA, Earth grid, and zodiac. This is the early Star Mother model. And this is the 15 great circles in 3 dimensions of the Ouroboros, the Ophanim Angels grid. 3 circles per cube, 5 cubes per dodeca, equals 15 great circles in perfect symmetry. So here's how you begin. You find the magnetic cross in the land and you enact it in stone. And later that becomes the labyrinth. The labyrinth is sometimes implicit and not explicit in Native American stone circles. So what is your stone structure doing? Here's an example of a stone structure. It's called ex cathedra, or cathedral for short. Ex cathedra means from the chair, which is from the place of leverage. So the chairman is the one, the cathedra. The chairman is the one who has access to the magnetism of the earth. It comes from the word catheter, which means access to blood, the catheter, which comes from the word cathar, which is very cathartic, right? Okay, which is the place where the magnetic blood of the land is unpacked. And what you're suggested to notice here, as you're looking at the cathedra of Machu Mandir, of the Mother in Aurobindo in India, what does it look like? Here's a hint. Look at that picture. Now look at this picture. This is a virus. You see how the virus gets access to the blood? It does it with a screwing motion. The virus is mostly DNA. The DNA comes down here and screws itself through the cell membrane. So cell membrane gets screwed. And the result is penetration. That's what a cathedral does. It screws its way into the grid. Now the grid doesn't mind giving up a little bit of its blood if it's going to create a structure that can serve Gaia, the collective mind, yeah? So the first thing that has to happen to make a cathedral is to make the earth bleed, which is what happens when you raise a sword from a stone. The S word from the S tone, you get the line from the circle. That's what the Jed, the raising of the Jed, is called. And the one who can do it is called the Jedi, right? And this, in Sumerian, was called the Shem, the raising of the highward firestone, the Shem stone. And the person who did it was from An Anunnaki, which is Monday's story. So the Shem An, shaman, was one who could raise this highward firestone and get the magnetic blood to converge. Has anybody here ever seen a dragon come out of the earth and fly? There's a famous book in geomantic circles, or a good book, I don't know how famous it is, by David Yarrow. It's called The Dragon in the Ice Castle. And it's about magnetic lines in geomancy and feng shui. Now, in The Dragon in the Ice Castle, David describes very vividly one day having this experience of seeing a magnetic current clairvoyantly, very clearly, come out of the earth and begin to fly. The dragon took wing. At first we thought these Chinese people telling these dragon fairy tales were telling fairy tales. Not true. It's physics. If you take a fast enough shuttered video camera and you look at a bleeding power company transformer, you see these magnetic worms coming off of it that look like parasites. And at first they seem to be able to steer, but then you realize they're a little bit dizzy. So the transformer, by being unable to embed, is creating astral pollution. And the astral pollution comes in the form of these magnetic worms whose ultraviolet cocoon comes off the transformer, and you can see them with a digital video camera, or if you're clairvoyant. Yeah? Well, that's what happens to these magnetic fields coming out of the earth. Some of them are a little bit parasitic because they don't know how to make their own fire. Others of them are the true high-winged Draco dragons. Well, this ability to evoke the dragon current was called the Thumper in Dune. Anybody ever remember? The magnetic worms in Dune? Shailud. It was the name we later called Shailud the devil. But Shailud was the name of the children of Uru, which was the bastard son of Enlil, later called Metatron, I think. So this ability to evoke a branching algorithm in the magnetic worm of the shapeshifter of DNA was related to this ability to raise the Jed, the sword from the stone, to evoke a magnetic field that went in a line when it used to go in a circle. Magnetism in a circle is called matter. Magnetism in a line is called energy. The translation of vorticity that makes the difference is a spin path. So this led to what's called the harmonic module plan. Supposing you have 4 billion human beings whose DNA is intensely aware that it's going to be fatal if you cannot get through the speed of light. And so every time your DNA thinks it's close to be able to squirt an ultraviolet shape-shifting magnetic worm through the speed of light, your DNA gives it a shot. Now, most women, when this happens, say, I got a headache and I need a pill. Okay? But the fact is, it's your DNA saying, I'm trying to squirt now, otherwise you're going to die. So when you respond negatively to the electricity of your bliss, you're in fact informing your DNA that you choose death over life. So creating a legitimate spin path for bliss to accelerate biological magnetism into stars is the purpose of DNA and government. And so we devised this plan called the Harmonic Module almost 20 years ago now, which was a description of the biophysics of group bliss process. And today we're much closer now that we have the software for Heart Tuner to share and phase lock heart harmonics over the internet. But you see the concept. This was a description of a stadium with thousands of people, and you have a laser show here spinning dodecaecosa, and the phase lock of a large number of human hearts. And the laser projectors with mirrors create this optical cocoon here, which acts as a container in the ultraviolet for collective human bliss. Has anybody ever talked to a person who operates lasers at laser shows? I met quite a few. A guy named Robert Mueller in Western Washington there, and another guy named Bob Zawada who wrote the cancer article with me, and another guy named Bruce Lipton. These were all people who used to operate laser shows for entertainment industry. And I'm telling you this story for one particular reason, that all three of them independently reported something to me which I found fascinating. They said that they had observed that they became physiologically addicted to operating laser shows. So this is an addiction, not unlike a narcotic addiction, that if you get around laser shows and you do it regularly, eventually you're addicted. Okay? What does that mean? So the laser is coherent light acting as a carrier wave for the light of the aura. And suddenly you have a dissipation, a distribution path for the light of your own aura. And if you haven't found another way to get bliss, to project the light of your own aura, you literally become physically addicted to being at and steering lasers. What does this tell you about the need of DNA to steer its ultraviolet into a laser? Fascinating idea, huh? Yeah? So this is the concept of the harmonic module. So right now we have the capability of linking 6 to 12 hearts over the internet using an averaging function, an algorithm. We're eventually going to be able to link a large number of hearts over the internet. And the ability to do that requires agreement. The ability to have biological entrainment requires psychological agreement. So consensus process, political agreement, is identical with the biological process of creating entrainment between hearts. When hearts can link up, political agreement will necessarily follow, because the biological information transfer sets the baud rate, the handshaking, for political agreement. Yeah? Precipitation is as easy as understanding why clouds gather over children when they dance barefoot in mud blissfully. If you take most average children and ask them, they can focus their attention in a cloud and put a hole in it. The physics is simple to understand, that the difference between water in the vapor state and water in the droplet state is the seed of symmetry which charge creates. So by moving capacitive fields into concentricity of focus, literally charge implosion, you steer the water vapor into columnation, literally the fabrication of an envelope. So the function of the cloud seeding machine was to plant seeds of capacitive symmetry to turn the vapor into a droplet. But you do the same thing with your attention electrically. So cloud seeding is called precipitation, right? So the physics of making rain is the physics of columnating magnetism to teach the physics of how water can share. So the vapor needs not be separate, but can share space in the envelope we call the droplet. So let's test our understanding of this by looking at James DeMayo's paper called Desertification and Patriarchy from the Orgone Wilhelm Reich literature. So James DeMayo, this is at soulinvitation.com/desertify. He's famous. He runs an Orgone Institute in America, James DeMayo. And he writes this paper. And what he observed was, if you are an archaeologist or an anthropologist, and you make a map of the spread of laws making public affection illegal in North Africa, you would have made a map of the spread of the Sahara Desert. So just strictly anthropologically, strictly from a statistical viewpoint, if you track the spread of laws where public affection is illegal, you're tracking the spread of a desert. It's simple population data. Okay? So now, having observed this statistic that if you pass a law making public affection illegal, you create a desert, we need to understand the physics. The physics is, when you touch someone, what happens is that the shortwave in your body has the opportunity to check for symmetry with respect to the longer wave of magnetism in someone else's body. And so there's a moment at which the magnetism inside you and the magnetism inside the person you touch check for which waves are shareable, called symmetry, with the result that touch is literally the creation of the possibility of biology's first longer wave. So creating long waves in biology requires columnation, which requires touch. So in effect, what happens is that passion and glandular touch and the ability to fabricate long waves in people creates columnation in the clouds and thus rainmaking. Or, for example, when Bill Witherspoon put a Sri Yantra in the desert by carving a shallow ditch in the shape of a Sri Yantra, which was like a mile across, it was huge. was the size of about 6 football fields. And then he just pours paramagnetic sand in the shallow ditch in the shape of a Sri Yantra. And he measured the improvement in rainfall and soil fertility over the next several years. He fabricated a microclimate. It's like the lady who arrived at my farm, I used to say the princess on the pea. And she said, "Oop, please remove the screen from the window because it's fractionating the air." If you take a flow form which has braided water into extreme laminar coherence at the bottom, improved seed germination, surface tension, specific gravity, and sorting solids by mass, and light scattering coherence measure. If you take that same water and you pass it through a sieve or a strainer, you lose a lot of those wonderful possibilities, probabilities. And what's the physics? The physics is that the laminar coherence is a braiding operation that if you fractionate it, you create death. So extrapolating the principle here, fractionation is death, fractality is life. Yeah? So the physics here is, if you take a whole apple and you bite into a whole, fresh, really good apple, speaking of lunch, what happens? You feel a tingle, don't you? You feel a charge. Now, if you take the same apple and you chop it up with a metal knife and you cook it and you take a bite of it, what do you taste? No tingle, right? Well, the new information I have for you today is the tingle is the food. They didn't tell you that before in school. So instead of paying people to process your food, you pay people for the privilege of keeping their hands off of it, right? So in the West, we're accustomed, the more food has been processed, the more we pay for it. But it should be the opposite. The less food has been touched, the more you should pay for it. Because fractionation versus fractality, it's the charge density that is the food. So you begin to douse for that, and this will then be the introduction to our twinkling eyes conversation tomorrow, where you simply select life force in everything you eat and everyone you hug, and thus each spin. So this creates the charge density we call life force and awareness. Well, you have 3 kinds of structures. One kind of structure that bends magnetism coherently. You have another kind of structure that has almost no effect on magnetism. It can be fairly neutral. Then you have another kind of structure that actively fractionates and messes up the magnetism, like heavy metal. You will never find heavy metal in any ancient sacred structure. Almost never. Will you ever find bliss in the presence of heavy metal? Probably not. The heavy metals, the ones that are worst are aluminum. Next bad is maybe steel. Better is maybe nickel or copper. Better is titanium. The amalgam is fatal in your teeth for lots of reasons. We'll discuss that tomorrow some. And better yet is silver or gold. But better yet is no metal at all. Any homeopath will tell you, you run, not walk home, to throw everything aluminum out of your house, right? If you put your bread in an aluminum bread box, you're better off to throw it out than eat it. Okay? So the physics of these things has to do with the geometry of charge that's introduced into the food. Yeah? So what we're understanding now is that life force is charge. Therefore, everything about our house needs to be the dielectric field to hold charge. So as you gradually reduce the metal in your structures, they're able to hold more capacitance and thus support more life force. Yeah? So this is an example of, we're going to discuss the high frequency content and the relationship of high frequencies to dowsing. Specifically, we'll discuss microwave and infrared in this section of the lecture. The background for this is Professor Phil Callahan in Florida has been invited by the State Department of Agriculture to determine why billions of these beautiful little love bugs have been committing hara-kiri by killing themselves on the truck driver's windshield, and they seem to aim for the trucks. So the question became, why? And so Professor Callahan realized it was the smell of the ketone in the diesel fume emission. But then in order to understand how to fix the problem, he had to discover the physics of smell. And in summary, the answer to the question is infrared. And so here's how it works. That the trace ketone in the air, when and only when you have the presence of air movement and the presence of air moisture, then in that case do you get smell. And the way he was able to prove the physics was by taking some of that air that had both moisture and air movement in it, the jostling of the molecules of air creates an infrared. You know what a laser is? Now do you know what a maser is? Now do you know what a saser is? A sound laser and a microwave laser, right? So the air's ability to pass infrared creates a very narrow permissivity notch where infrared cannot get through the air in a very narrow bandwidth. Turns out to be the key to the sense of smell. So physicists who tell you that your nose is smelling 1 part per billion, per billion, per billion, per billion, per billion molecules is crazy. That's not the physics of smell at all. The physics of the sense of smell is an infrared field effect. As you can tell if you ever talk to any of the good, like Francis Sequoian and Louis Acker, when they wrote the book Handbook of Astrology and talked about the rose smell that filled the room, when they talked about whatever house of the zodiac it was that's associated with it, they didn't bring any roses into the room, but they created the field effect. So what happens is Phil Callahan measured the diameter of the insect antenna and found it was the wavelength in the infrared that corresponded to that sense of smell. So it was the sex spherome smell infrared that was attracting the love bug. So now, do you know why the Anunnaki Teltos said, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman"? In fact, you can smell the blood because there's an infrared and ultraviolet cocooning effect that the light, the cell, the DNA gives off that light when it's excited, literally, yes? So you would smell the blood of an Englishman. Anybody know why the highest percentage of Rh negative blood on the planet is in England? Rh negative means rhesus monkey absent. And the reptilian DNA was recessive to everywhere but jolly old England. Wonder why? Well, Elizabeth from Lizard Born, does that give you any clues? No. So you have to have this, you have to understand the stiff upper lip in Parliament was because when mom's a lizard, you don't get much compassion, so you can't cry, so your lip gets... I think I was talking with stiff upper lip. Okay. So anyway, we'll go into those. We'll manage to step on the toes of just about every culture on the planet before we're done. So don't feel anyone's particularly honored. Wait till we get to the Italians, right? Okay. You have Rh negative blood, which is actually rather rare on the planet, but in England, yes, about 10-15%. But you have Rh negative blood, and you're from England, and you have all the Angles from the Ans of Anunnaki and Anu, right? Tuatha De Dan and Daniel, Solari An. So the Ans were those, the sun gods, and that was the lineage of the Drag Ans, who had Agni, fire, in their blood. Ag, right? The dragons, the Agni. So this is the story we're going to play with. We'll do this, and we're going to not go... If we go there now, we won't come back. So, but this descendancy from those who still had fire in their blood was the Anglish bloodline, yes? And so the Anglish is the language of the Angles. So looking at the angles here, we see that the microwave emissions of the pineal epiphyses and the thymus and the pituitary and... This was a measure of the microwave emissions of living human glands. And the point is, look, here is the microwave emissions of the glands when they're singing and happy. And now you take those same glands over a geopathic zone, and whoops, the pineal went down to nothing, the thymus. So suddenly the thymus is not able to sing in the microwave, and it's measurable. And you know where they measured this? at the geopathic zones of the water vein crosses under the houses. Just what you were talking about. Who was telling us the story? Yes, just exactly what you were talking about. The inhibition of cellular microwave due to geopathic crossings of the underground water vein structure. Here we're looking at the underground water under Chart. So you're creating a DC magnetic current which is steering the high frequencies. A low frequency, almost DC, a ley line, steering high frequencies, in this case microwave. Well, why would cellular microwave be so critical to facilitating biological communication in general? And here I want to introduce the Bob Dratch microwave scanning emissions technology. Anybody familiar? Well, it's very simple. Bob notices that every time any living human cell uses or stores energy, it always does it by adding or subtracting to the bond distance from adenosine diphosphate to adenosine triphosphate, ADP to ATP. That is a teeter-totter. And the wavelength of that teeter-totter, the quantum distance from ADP to ATP, is measurable in the microwave. And so, in effect, every cellular energy transaction has that wavelength in common. It's the dollar bill of all cellular energy transactions. So, in point of fact, if you scan a living cell or a body for that frequency in the microwave, you can make a three-dimensional map of biological fire. Literally, where is metabolism in your body? It's where that spectral emission is focused. So Bob was there in Boulder at Greg Hoag's Metaforms, and Wendy, my friend, was there, and he took this microwave scanner. It's a golden mean cross-section scanning horn gun, and the pickup in the microwave scanner is a gold foil cross in golden proportion, and the microwave amplifier is a waveguide that was an etching off a pyramid wall, literally. Microwave amplifiers, you can only understand them if you have a lot of background in ceremonial magic. It's true. Okay, so literally a waveguide to amplify microwave is what we call a Celtic rune, okay? And insects navigate by them. So he takes this high-gain microwave amp and he scans Wendy's spine. This is an old story, I've told it before. And sure enough, he takes this little strip chart showing the changes in microwave on down her spine. And he stands there and he narrates a history of psychological trauma since her youth, looking only at the microwave of her spine. And when he was done, she was crying. Yeah? So he's noticed the geometry of every place in her spine where the microwave can't go, and he mapped the history of psychology's trauma. Yeah? So then he takes the same microwave scanner and he turns over and steps on the porch, and sure enough, it is the ultimate dowsing tool. So if you want to know where the ley lines are, you check where there's conductivity to that wavelength in the microwave, which we call cellular metabolism. So this is a symbiotic relationship between cell metabolism and the Earth grid. Well, next thing you know, Bob Dratch found that his invention was declared a threat to national security and declared top secret by the CIA. That's how good it was. So the point is that communication at a biological level requires the conductivity in the high-frequency microwave. It's a song line for cell juices. The way I suggest proving to your government that they have to move the microwave tower is by measuring soil compaction under it, because it's a measure of death. So the hazard of microwaves in your cell phone, etc., is very real in my view and should be avoided at all costs. So this is an example of a relationship that's pretty intimate between the long-wave DC currents underground and the conductivity in the microwave and infrared. That's the basis of cellular communication in general. Microwave ovens and microwave food. The thing that the science did not tell you and should have is the longer the wavelength in which you induce the heat, the less it destroys life. Conversely, the shorter the wavelength in which you create the heat, the more it destroys life. Because heat is merely a measure of destructive interference, literally chaos. And so if you introduce the chaos at a short wavelength, relatively, you're being more destructive to life. So for example, food that's been heated from wood heat through stone has long waves, whereas food that's been heated in a microwave has short waves of excitement. And so the longer the wavelength of the heat, the healthier it is. If you're going to cook your food at all, use long waves. The story was that of those who had the the HIV positive, the ones who used a microwave died first. The ones who used electric heat died next. The ones who used gas heat lived longer. The ones who used wood heat lived longer yet. And the ones who used no heat at all, they're still here. Okay? So it is very important to recognize the wavelength in which you introduce the heat is critical to how much life force you're destroying.